to the Weekly Bioanalysis, a KCAS podcast.
Hello and welcome to the 19th episode of the Weekly Bioanalysis. My name is Dominic Warino and I'm the Senior Scientific Advisor for all things related to ligand binding assays, biomarkers, and flow cytometry. I have been with KCS for a little over 7.5 years, but I've been in the bioanalytical space for close to 26 years. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. John Perkins.
Hello, I'm John Perkins, Senior Scientific Advisor with a focus on all things related to LC-MS technologies. I've been with KCS almost 11 months, but have been in the bioanalytical space for over 25 years.
Today's podcast, as always, is brought to you by KCAS, Bioanalytical and Biomarker Services. KCAS is a bioanalytical laboratory located in Kansas City, Kansas, serving the pharmaceutical and biotech industries for over 40 years now. John and I are senior scientific advisors at KCAS, and either or both of us are available to answer any questions you may have regarding this podcast or any of KCS services. We are glad that you are tuning into us today as we are winding down the 2020 summer in the midst of a pandemic. As we mentioned, this will be our 19th week recording the podcast. So if you're interested in other episodes, they can be found at kcsbio.com. As a reminder, you can also follow us at Twitter at The Weekly Bio and at KCS Bio. As we mentioned before, we started this whole thing because of social distancing getting in the way of our normal communication, which by normal we mean going out and visiting people face to face. And so even today, John and I are in completely different places. I'm in Kansas City, John is in upstate New York, and our producer is somewhere in the Midwest, roaming the fields, so to speak.
One day we'll track him down.
You bet. This weekly podcast gives us a chance to connect with all of you, and we are hoping it gives you a chance for you to get to know us. And even more importantly, it's a chance for you to get to know KCS and the services we provide. As always, the podcast will be a review of the latest news and resources, and then a focus on a topic of our choosing before discussing any feedback we've had. As always, we're constantly looking for topics, and we'd be happy to discuss something that you might want us to cover. So get out there on social media and post something, and we'd be glad to take it on as an agenda item. So then when we're done with everything, we're going to wrap up with a little teaser for next week. We'll let you know what is coming up in the future. So again, we were looking forward to a fun 19th episode. So today, to kick us off, John is going to go over today's podcast topic a bit before we jump into the news and resource section. John?
So here's today's agenda. We'll go through the news and notes and resources, really looking at COVID stuff first, then some non-COVID items, before we move on to the main portion of the podcast, which is this week is a quarterly business review of drug development during a pandemic and its impact on KCS. And then we'll move to feedback and questions before, as Dominic says, giving a taster for next week's episode.
All right, John. So let's just dive right into it.
So let's move to the news and resources section. First up was something we alluded to last week, but it is really fascinating, and it's a bit down to the supply chain of vaccines, assuming that one is approved, because a number of the candidates actually have major stability issues that they have to be stored frozen, and so that can have a real impact as to how easy it is to roll them out. I mean, as a bit of context, I remember working on a bunch of retroviral drugs, and where the main market was looking to move into Africa, and so we had to do a lot of testing in terms of elevated temperature to test that the drugs were stable, and that was a big driver behind dried blood spots as a potential sampling to see if you could adequately sample off cards to then get a good picture of what the drug was doing out in the field. So it's fascinating that it's had this roll-on impact into vaccines, but the temperatures we're talking about are much more extreme.
Yeah, no, John, I think it's always a challenge with any sort of large-scale vaccine that needs to go into
developing.
Developing. Thank you. Those developing nations, it's always been a struggle. And I've got similar stories. I'm familiar with dried blood spots. That was a lot of how to try and get samples out to test the efficacy of the vaccine, right? That's what you were alluding to there, at least I think, or at least the efficacy of the drug in a PK setting. And, people did HIV studies on dried blood spots because you can count CD4 cells. They're stable for a long, long time. So in some of the programs that I've worked on in the HIV space, familiar with that, as well as the restrictions on supply chains and cold supply of things, and really even did some helping of a good friend of mine who was in Nepal working. I think I've mentioned this individual to you, and he, had tragically died over there. But anyhow, it's they were looking to do vaccines for chickens, and so that became the making the vaccine and storing it at -80 was out of the question, just not even doable. So they actually are still working on this over there, and they've made it in the feed, so it's actually in a room temperature storage. But back to um, the companies that are doing it on Moderna, and they said that they can get it down to -20 for 7 days. That doesn't buy them a whole lot, I don't think. And certainly the BioNTech Pfizer one is a -80. So, and those are the two leading ones. So it's kind of we'll probably touch on that in a minute, how excited we are about how the vaccines are moving along. But there's this little Achilles heel, right, John, that's really kind of causing some issues with what maybe it might not be a problem here in first world nations and so forth. And then I'll just touch on how Novavax is actually the one who's got one that looks like it's the lead candidate for just standard refrigeration. So interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating because with the Pfizer and the Moderna, what you have is two vaccines that we're already looking at as unproven technologies. They're mRNA based vaccines that we haven't ever seen one approved. Then we have the stability issue, like you mentioned. The Pfizer one needs storage at -80. We come up against this in clinical trials where where you're looking at drugs that need or samples that need to be stored at -70. Many hospitals don't have the ability to store samples at -70, so that's why we do a lot of testing at -20 to make it more applicable to hospitals. So if you really got a vaccine that needs that kind of storage, it drastically limits the number of places that can take on and distribute that vaccine. So a huge challenge here.
Yeah, for sure, John. It's one that I think it will continue to be something that will be rearing its ugly head as we move towards some sort of vaccine approval, which hopefully, there's talks of it happening before the year is out. And these are the two drugs that are leading that path right now. And, those studies have just ballooned up. They're dosing 30,000 people here and so forth. So I don't know, John, but it is, let's move on to the next topic, but definitely still some work to be done there. I think really the great thing about all of this, what engineering, right, or what science is out there will overcome some of these things. It's amazing.
Exactly. I think that's what we're seeing throughout this is how much ingenuity is being applied to this. So although the problems are coming up and being presented, there's a lot of focus on solving them. So things are moving forward quickly.
And they're getting to those problems quicker. So everything's moving faster. They're identifying the problems and solving them quicker. All great stuff.
Yep. So we move on to the next one, still sticking on vaccines, but we don't have the first ones approved yet. Obviously, we've got phase 3 studies going on, but people are already working on the next generation. And this is again another fascinating article where the people who are in these second generation vaccines talking about the first generation, they're all based on a single principle of basically going at the protein, the which what's it called, the spike protein. Sorry, these are all designed to go at the spike protein. But there's a couple of teams working on nanoparticles where they're coming with a number of different copies of the tip of the spike protein, and at least in animal studies, they're showing much more reaction to the vaccine in terms of building antibodies. So it looks, again, it's like we touched on, how quickly people are applying all these different approaches to try and solve the issue, and how quickly things are moving. So really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's a lengthy article actually, and it touches on a lot of names that I'm familiar with, a lot of people that I've met. Surprisingly, this is one that is quite interesting and fascinating around what they're dubbing the second generation of COVID, as you kind of articulated there, John. All the current ones are going after a specific target or targets on the capsid protein there, the spike protein, excuse me. And these are going to start looking and dissecting probably even a little bit more strategically at other epitopes or multiple epitopes, or even, I believe there's mention of getting back towards, the traditional attenuated viruses and manipulating those. So taking away of the traditional antibody responses and trying to not just produce antibody responses, but to augment T cell responses. And that
Sure.
we touch on this in there, and that becomes a critical and a much more sustainable approach towards things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think, like I say, it'll be interesting to see where we hear about next. Moving on to our next item, I always watch what's going on around the world simply because of being from Europe in the first place, and stumbled across an article today talking about the state of the pandemic in Europe. Seen a number of graphs over the last couple of weeks looking at comparative numbers in terms of population and cases between Europe and the US. But what Europe is actually seeing is they sort of managed to quell the virus to a large extent, but they are seeing spikes up in a number of countries in Spain, France. I think the UK is seeing it too. But it's interesting because the article actually talks about, although they're seeing spikes up, they're less concerned about it because they got testing in place. So there's across the continent, testing's pretty much under control. But we do see commonality where people are going back to normal way of life. They're concerned, have they opened up too soon? And then the finger's being pointed at young people who are obviously going out enjoying themselves as young people do. So it's just an interesting article. I thought it's funny how we talked about Sweden having that laissez-faire approach, and now you've got other European countries taking a similar approach but amending it to their particular way of life. And it's also interesting, the UK's look to exit the EU through Brexit, and because they talked about this, the single state approach of the EU, but what COVID has shown, the single state approach in the EU doesn't exist. They have a European Parliament, but ultimately this has still come down to how each country has individually addressed COVID, and they're learning from each other, but it's really not that single solution affecting the entire continent.
Yeah, it's a great read in terms of like just the sheer numbers in here, right? So Spain is seeing upwards of 10,000 cases a day, and that's higher than the height of when this all broke out in the March-April timeframe. Yet, like you mentioned, I think there's a number of things that are not causing the panic. One, I think it's again a youthful individuals are getting it. Also, just the fact that it's known and you can test, and then that kind of diminishes the panic that we kind of felt in the spring. But there's also some signs that make you want to twitch a little bit in terms of the picture on the beach, and it looks like it's normal in Spain, and they're kind of ignoring some things. But there was some other real interesting reads about how the I guess I'm going to call it the lack of understanding of the virus had caused us to do things like no outdoor eating. We banned jogging in certain countries and all of that stuff. Well, now they're walking a lot of it back, but it's clear a mask, it's clear hand washing, and it's clear indoor dining is still somewhat challenging. Those
Yeah.
are the areas now that we can focus on it, even though the numbers are kind of increasing here. I think what's happening is you've got the population who's most susceptible can be a behavior that prevents them from getting infected. And really, those are the people that we feel like are probably dying from this. Although, none of us really want. I certainly, again, it gets back to those. Well, people were having coronavirus parties so that everybody got infected. Like, man, stay away from that. That is not a good idea. Just no, you should not want to get infected. And then I'll end with interesting. It looks like public transportation is being deemed as somewhat safe so long as you're wearing a mask and you adhere to the washing of your hands after travel. So some really good stuff in there, despite some spike, right, John?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. It was very interesting. I think I read somewhere else today. Again, harking back to the early days of the virus, we were told to avoid, be really careful touching surfaces, and there was no emphasis on the airborne transmission. Whereas now it's really flipped in terms of how we address it. Again, like you say, through the use of face masks and everything. As we learn more about it, I think you still, every article you read, there's always something that pops out that says we still don't really understand this virus. We're still learning about it. When you read vaccine articles, that we talk about build-up of antibodies, but we're still not sure, is that the measure of effectiveness against the virus and things like that. It still comes through loud and clear. We're dealing with this quickly, but we're still learning about it and learning new things every day.
Yeah, definitely, John. And for time's sake, we'll let's move on to what I think is arguably the most interesting article, because I am a cat owner. 5 years now, converted. I was cat adverse prior to that, and now I'm a huge cat fan. And this study around, Gilead and their remdesivir, and they're saying that they are finding ways to study, COVID in cats, and that's leading to some treatments and so forth. So a feel-good story around, and it even dabbles in how the University, Kansas State University had some origins within this program, but it looks like they've got a way to keep cats safe from COVID, which makes me feel better about my kitty cat.
Yeah, it's interesting. So last week, our team all met via Teams, and it was Pet Day on Teams, where there was a parade of cats and dogs through not to forget the fish and other other
The
animals
squirrel,
through
John.
the
Don't forget
call.
that squirrel.
Yes. So, this is all about feline infectious peritonitis, and what they found was it was University of Alberta that a drug developed to treat a coronavirus that causes this FIP actually also inhibits the main protease of SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV as well. So the thought is that yes, we could possibly apply this to coronavirus or COVID-19. Like you say, a company licensed that from Kansas State, and because they've done preclinical in cats, they think they can accelerate the research into humans to see if there's a application here. So yeah, it's funny how even in this, people say cats aren't useful. That certainly seems to come as a fairly common message from dog lovers. But here
Yeah.
you are, cats may actually be giving us the solution to this.
Yeah, and I think even like the HIV initiative got a lot of help from studying cats. So this is not new with, I think, vaccines or even viral infections in cats, because there's also not only is there an HIV strain that is affecting cats, but there was also I believe it was some sort of lymphoma that was studied through cats as well. So nice history here. And certainly, like you said, all those dog lovers out there need to stop hating on cats so much and understand that not only are they great pets, but they're also potentially saving lives. So, John, one thing this one is a tough topic to talk about. I'm going to bring it up anyways. It was the CDC came out and said that approximately 6%, and the numbers were a few weeks ago. So only about 6% of the COVID deaths are what they called legit. And of course, immediately Fauci walked that back, and basically what they were saying was only about 6% of the deaths, and at the time it had been on like 160,000 deaths, so approximately 9,000 deaths were what they would deem COVID was the only cause of death. And so that's kind of interesting. I wonder if that's why we're seeing this huge delta between the US and other countries. Now, clearly there's, Fauci makes a great argument around, well, hey, wait a minute, people with type 2 diabetes shouldn't be dying at this age. Clearly, COVID's having more of an impact on the death rate than 6%, but it was something that, I felt like it was posted and then it had to be retracted, and what I like about it is we got to start feeling confident about the world out there and our safety. Even if a vaccine comes, So some of that in there, I thought there was some goodness to it, but it just, the numbers are still so hard to kind of comprehend or believe when it comes to how deadly this is. I mean, we all can agree this is more than just your standard flu outbreak, but we are getting into a point where when you see 10,000 new cases in Spain a day, well, what's happening, right, John? It just, there's got to be probably somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah, there's a number of things to dissect here. I think it is important to see how many people who are healthy with no underlying conditions who have died of this, and that's where the 6% comes from. And that's 6% of 180,000 in this country. That I should have done the math beforehand, but that's around 10,000 cases. I think you got 850,000 people died worldwide. If that 6% carries across that, then you're talking around 50,000 people who had no other underlying infection or disease or anything have died from this. That's a big number. I mean, basically, again, in the walk back from the CDC, COVID is implicated for all the ones that they have reported as deaths. And yes, the majority of people have got underlying conditions, but what COVID has done is accelerated their deaths. So the impact on them and their families is massive. I mean, you think about, if you've got an underlying condition, you're managing it, you know how to deal with it, you have plans as to what you're going to do with your life. But COVID has come across and cut those plans dead for 180,000 families. So the knock-on effect to people is horrible. There's an account on Twitter called Faces of COVID, and I just stumbled across one yesterday, and it was basically listing an 18-year-old girl who died of COVID, and she actually had been diagnosed with lupus, so that was her underlying condition. But you think about that, that's an 18-year-old girl whose life has been cut short because of this virus. She could have managed lupus. She would have had a life, a fertile life in front of her. But it's gone. And it's like what always bothers me is the human cost. It's not just about the person who's died; it's the family who are left behind. I mean, I know when my parents passed, a couple of years ago, they died very quickly after each other, and it took me months to get over it. So I'm very aware of the effect of this and what the effect on people downstream. It's
Yeah,
I would never trivialize this virus, and I think that's why I'm really happy to talk about this every week and talk about how this affects people and the progress that we're making to try and deal with it.
absolutely. You said the key word, the progress there. So I feel like in the scenario you described, now that we're so COVID honed in on it, I'd like to think even somebody with lupus who is COVID positive, they're going to treat the right way and they don't die. So I think a
Yeah,
lot of that is, the death rate is clearly slowed down. It's dropped. It's really, I think we're managing it, but let's not suddenly stop wearing masks and go to rock shows with 50,000 people at them. No, that's not what I'm saying. I don't want to be misinterpreted. What I'm saying is hopefully that situation that you've described, if they know they've got lupus and they know they've got COVID, there's a regimen of trying to treat that person to prevent it. Because before it came, it was like, wow, this lupus patient is here. They probably got the flu. Oh, let's treat them this way. Right now, that treating them for the flu is not the right treatment if it's more of a respiratory virus, right? So those are the things that I hope will prevent that. But I don't want to lose sight of just how hard it is on anybody that's lost somebody. And certainly I am learning more of like some Massachusetts people that are friends of mine that have lost some people. So, and again, it's mostly grandparents and things like that. But to your point, John, it's never easy to have that happen around. No matter what age you are, no matter how mentally strong you are, it's something that you can't prepare for, and you can't really put your hand on or put words into how it makes one feel, right? You have to kind of go through it, and everybody goes through it slightly differently, I think. So with that,
Just
let's
one
sure, go
final
ahead.
point on this. I think
Yeah,
the other part of it is, in the early days, we were treating this purely as respiratory, whereas what we've learned over the course of the last few months is it has impact on many other organs. So, of course, it does. The medical community are learning from that and have other approaches to help treat, you know, treat the virus. So I think that plays into helping sustain people's lives. So hopefully we do continue to see the death rate go down versus the number of cases.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Even in the lupus case, they're going to treat some of the things they know that are going to cause and spark the lupus because of the understanding of, hey, it's not just respiratory, like you said, although it may be affecting the respiratory. We know now the liver might, the heart, in particular, the heart, all of that. The awareness is so much higher, as you had stated. So maybe we'll switch gears on to let's go one or two last topics here, John. We'll go with the Harvard. AbbVie and Harvard have teamed up to be ready for next new viruses. So tell us a little bit about what that means, John.
So yeah, this is another interesting article that basically AbbVie aren't exactly they don't have a big reputation in the viral space. They have had approved viral drugs, but they're actually teaming up with Harvard, and they've got 4 initiatives to really look at addressing different conditions associated with potential viruses. The concern here is we've seen 3 viruses skip from animals into humans in the last 18 years. So if it's happened that often in the last 18 years, it's going to happen again. So we want to be prepared and understand how future viruses might affect us. So the 4 categories are immunity and immunopathology. So it's a collaboration between someone at Harvard who specializes in that and someone within AbbVie. Host targeting for antiviral therapies, taking the same approach, therapeutic antibodies, and then small molecules as well. So I think it's just getting going. I mean, it might mean that AbbVie gets a pipeline of potential molecules ready to address future conditions. I think it also, to me, illustrates the increased collaboration we're seeing across the industry. So here we've got a large pharma collaborating with a university to see what they can do to be prepared. But it's just to me, I like seeing this kind of this story.
Yep. No, it just makes us better prepared for whatever Mother Nature throws at us next. They're working on just having a gamut of ways, the 4 categories you went over, to kind of next time something like this pops up, they're going to have ways to break it down quicker, putatively quicker, and certainly more effective. And what we were just talking about, hopefully that knocks down any sort of major death rates and things of that nature. So really a cool thing. And then like you said, we love to see academic labs working with major pharmaceuticals in a more open forum. They've always done that, but this is much more, I would say, before they dabbled on a project, this is a big partnership, a big investment, and one that should be worked on for years to come. So we'll keep our eye out for the next generation of vaccines coming from that group, or at least the next generation of therapeutics for vaccines coming from that group. So great stuff there. And then let's do one last one. Not my favorite person in the world, although Elon Musk and his Tesla and his space programs. Well, he's dabbling now in something called a Neuralink venture, right? So they're trying to create a mind reading chip. So they showed it can work in animals. Pretty good stuff here. I think they're trying to. This is a lot like the Matrix, right? That's what this is. If you know the movie, I think they're trying to hardwire my head, and maybe I know kung fu. If you know
I want that. I want that nowhere near me, quite honestly. But yeah, we'll see. Yeah, I read it, and it's like, oh, this is way too science fiction for me, and I'm not in a good way either. Yeah, I think I can see where they're coming from in terms of potential medical applications, but as they say at the moment, it's just an ability to read. It's not an ability to stimulate in the opposite direction. So it will be it will be certainly fascinating to see where it goes. But a little bit too much into the scary end of things right now.
It's pretty good though, right? So they've they still haven't solved. So this is all in the the neurodegenerative space, all in the where there's some severed nerves or disconnected nerves or some brain damage and things like that. But to your point, they've been able to cue one half of it and coordinate with its let's call it partner, but they can't quite cue the other, because if you are aware of how that all works. You got to get the neurons to cue and attach. And then they're like talking about stitching them together. I mean, it's pretty cool stuff. Like, it's definitely lovely for anybody that's, God forbid, a car accident, all those things. I mean, people potentially could be, people who are quadriplegics or paraplegics. They may be really impacted by this, John, and it's fantastic. Yeah.
From that perspective, absolutely. Yeah, if
Yeah.
it gives people hope,
You're not,
I'm all in favour. I
yeah,
think
you're not letting anybody put a USB drive in your head anytime or an HDMI cable into your head anytime soon. But I don't know, John. I feel like some days, yeah, I'm okay. Just hook me up. So anyhow,
it may be our suspicion of Elon Musk being associated with it, I think, is partly there.
let's move on to our main portion here. Or yeah, John, let's move on to main portion. We'll cover drug approvals on our next podcast. If that's okay with you, John. I think we had a pretty good run of discussing of vaccines and stuff. So or do you want to do it, John? You
No,
tell me.
I think it can wait. It's
Okay.
I think it can definitely wait in the context of what we've done today. So I'm fine with that.
Yep. So we'll move on to our main portion, which today is what we'll call a quarterly business review or a QBR of drug development during a pandemic, John. So, we started all of this because of the pandemic, and some of our initial podcasts, we went over really what was happening in terms of our business or the CRO business in general. So today it's about us sharing our experiences, 5-6 months later. And so, John, I think the first topic will just be overall business and the impact on small molecules or pharma. And then we'll talk about biopharma large molecules and even the PD biomarker space. So, John, you can kick us off with small molecules, and I'll start to chime in when needed. But what are you seeing? What's happening? Are there therapeutics? And maybe a little bit about what KCAS is working on.
Well, certainly in the early days, it was we saw that our involvement with COVID was mainly in the sample kitting and to support clinical trials. But what we've seen more and more in the small molecule space is we're being asked to support studies for drugs that are actually with the aim of addressing COVID-19, so actual therapeutics. And we're seeing a number of those come through, and we're still actively discussing, potential fresh projects. So COVID appears on a pretty regular basis in terms of therapies that we're looking to address.
Yeah, and so I'll just pick up on the biomarker space first. So I think there are at least 2 or 3 small molecule, like you said, first they were kidding, and now we've evolved into doing more of the PK analysis on those therapeutics. And at least 2 of them I know of were screening biomarker panels for, efficacy of the small molecule, the therapy. This isn't vaccines, right? This is people who are in some sort of cytokine storm state. They're late in the COVID infection, and so they're looking for things that can help abate that cytokine storm or reduce the inflammation. And so some of these drugs are doing that. They're respiratory specific or they're complement specific, all things that cut off the immune system at a really upstream process. Then subsequently you see diminishing of IFN gamma and TNF alpha circulating. And I even recently saw one. I know we're doing the PK for it. It's that compassion study in Italy. And that data looks beautiful from a biomarker perspective. For a good chunk of the patients, you can see levels really falling back below the limit of detection in these individuals, which clearly means they're going to survive. So great stuff there. And then just got word today, we are going to move forward with a hormonal in vitro study. That was something I kind of touched on where, the whole women seem to be more resistant to COVID infection, and they're teasing that down to some hormone specific to women. And so this group is going to do a study trying to demonstrate that. First, we'll start in some normals, and we'll look at some other steroids and compare it to some standard ways of abating immune, sort of abating challenges for stimulation of cytokines. So in an in vitro setting, you can show that something simple, you can take any sort of anti-inflammatory, give them like something like LPS, You get copious amounts of a cytokine. If you give them the LPS in conjunction with a steroid, it will knock some of it down. So then we're going to compare a hormone to the steroid, and then we're going to look at COVID patients. So stay tuned on that one. We can't talk too much about it, but it's really, I think, capitalizing on what we've learned about COVID in terms of it being the female male ratio. So good stuff there, John. We're certainly, for me personally, the biomarker space is kind of, for COVID, has, I don't want to say gone away, but the demand has dropped slightly. But on the flip side, clinical trials in general have opened back up. So we're seeing a lot of things that got stalled due to COVID have suddenly been back into the runway and are coming our way. And clinical trials in general are picking up. So there's this little ebb and flow happening. And I think we're right at that verge where COVID biomarker demand has dipped a little, but in general, clinical biomarker demand has gone up. And then I'll stop and take a breath and then touch on large molecules. But John,
Yeah.
that's kind of a 2 or 3 minute diatribe on what I'm seeing during COVID right now.
So I think I think you will see more COVID biomarker stuff come through as we're supporting early trials in the small molecule space. As we talk more with customers, the question of biomarkers is coming up. It's even happening in earlier discussions. You're actually talking about potential projects, and really the main focus of the project has been the small molecule therapeutic. But as we talk further, then there's additional discussion about potential biomarkers, and it's like, oh yeah, we have the panels, we can send you that information. So I think you'll see more. I wouldn't be surprised
Good.
at all.
Are you saying more clinical trials in general or more COVID specific biomarkers?
I think more COVID specific biomarkers. I suspect you'll see more on that front.
So the therapeutic space is, to me, and again, this is just an end of my world, right? It seems like many more therapies for COVID are small molecule drugs that are being repurposed for it. And biologics in general, there was an early blip there where they were using cocktails of IL-6 and TNF, or antibodies to IL-6 and TNF alpha. That is, to me, they've moved away from it unless it's like the last ditch, because that has other impacts when you start sopping up people's cytokines. It comes with a cost, if that makes sense. Now they're really susceptible to any infection. So now you've got an active COVID infection. You're knocking down the immune system. Is that the right thing to do, John? Right? It starts to get, although I think they've had some efficacy for it. The focus that those things have been somewhat, I don't know if backburner is the right word, but clearly there's been remdesivir as well as dexamethasone. So even steroidal treatments are starting to really become I don't know if standard of care is the right word, but within a certain, because we're diagnosing it so much quicker, people aren't getting to that point where they need ventilators and things like that, so that they're kind of, but the predominant drugs for therapeutics seem to be small molecules, at least in my world. So
I think so far, but so far that's the case, but obviously there's still a lot in development because we're still talking about drugs that are, either completing animal or moving into clinical. So there's plenty of attention here. One thing I think would be interesting to talk about. I mean, we talk about the business review. How about day-to-day operation? I mean, we're still. Our role is remote to the lab, but it also featured regular visits, so we could talk with the operation on a face-to-face basis. But that isn't happening. We're still operating on where key people who can drive the projects are on site, but those of us who are more peripheral are still not going into the site, although we're at the stage where we are starting to entertain visitors on site. So there's a little bit of opening up of the business, but it's still interesting that after it's almost 6 months of this, we're still almost like a 50-50 split between those on site and those not.
Yeah, you nailed it. So I mean, we've actually expanded more of our. So we had about a quarter of a mile away some office space for people like myself, and when you're in town, that area of footprint has almost doubled or tripled. And now we're allowed to put some of our QA and project managers and contracts back in to a office, but they're still socially distanced. So they have to keep, we were able to have the area before we themed, I think we said, okay, this can normally house like 25 people, but we're only going to have 5 there at any given time. And now, so now we've increased the footprint. So there's some more people that can go in there. But in terms of the laboratory, it's status quo. We have not, what we're practicing from late March, early April, we're still practicing now, with one exception, right? And that was as of September 1, we are allowing someone to come visit us. And in part, it's because someone was wanting to visit yesterday. So we did, in fact, have our first visitor. Of course, there was a lot of restrictions. But to your point, John, my understanding is we're going to stay in the mode we're in until at least January. That's our goal. We're not going to have any, increasing from where we're at in terms of the break room can have like 6 people in it at a time, or whatever the rules are. Because at one point it was like the break room had like 1 person at a time. So we've continued to stay the course with what's recommended. There's been some gates that have opened up that say, okay, now instead of X amount of people in a room, you could have capacity to 20%. It was 10% or whatever it is. So we've followed those rules and we're adhering to them. So I think in general, as an organization, we've invested a lot in it. I'm glad you brought it up. It's certainly something that, knock on wood, we have stayed COVID free in our organization. So I hope I didn't jinx it.
No, yeah, absolutely. Touch wood on it, etc. Yeah, I appreciate that attention to basically business continuity is important, but also the safety of people's equally crucial. So yeah,
there's no expectation, like there's no rush from our senior management and from our strategic leadership team. We're both part of that. We're all very pleased with the efficiencies that we've implemented to ensure that we can work remotely and still keep our capacity near 100%. I mean, it's never going to be 100% as if we had, a full house at the shop, but we've gotten to the point where we're highly efficient and we're close to normal capacity, and that's wonderful for our organization. John, I think there is one thing that really has actually probably increased or become more problematic on the biopharma and biomarker side, and that's the supply chain. This has become a real bigger issue on our end. And the 2 major areas that we're experiencing are matrix, and I think that's affecting the pharma side as well. So if you remember, we went out and procured copious amounts of reagents from humans and cynos, but that was 6 months ago. So that supply, we still have elements of that supply, but now we're ordering more. And what normally would take, I don't know, maybe a 2 to 3 business days is taking upwards of 14 business days. I mean, that's a big jump in terms of having to plan around things. And I think on average, if you try to get diseased matrix, that has gone from maybe a 3 to 4 week thing outward to like really 8-10 weeks is what we're being told if you want to get like diabetic plasma, for instance. So those are things that were much more readily available. I think COVID's having a major impact there. And then the other is in our flow cytometry supplies, because a lot of efforts being used in vaccine trials to do flow cytometric testing, as well as in general, I think the manufacturers are struggling to keep their capacity because it's all being shifted towards other things, right? So those are the 2 areas that we are like, so one flow reagent, we got told 9 months, so we had to do a workaround. So those are the things that have steadily increased. And we didn't talk about this for the last few months, but it's just, it went from, there's a 2 week lead time to 3 to 4 to now upwards of like 6 to 8 weeks to get some routine antibodies that are labeled with fluorescent tags for flow cytometry. So again, they say the priority is all the COVID testing, then we'll get to you. Those reagents sometimes they got to make them or pull them, or I don't know what happens. but we're really way down, and we will get bumped. And even recently, we hit a snag with our one of the mesoscale discovery kits we wanted. That took upwards of 8 weeks lead time, and normally the lead time is about 1 to 2. Other reagents are 2 to 3 from MSD. This particular one spiked up to 8. So what the other thing is, I think it's getting worse, is what I'm saying. A lot of this has happened in the last 4 or 5 weeks, and so I think in the coming weeks it may get even a little bit worse before it gets better. So a little bit of just things you got to deal with in a CRO space during a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly had talked about tube availability and things like that in past podcasts, and it's something. We definitely did the right thing in terms of ramping up, making sure we had excess supplies for what our planned projects were. But yeah, this is obviously going to make things more challenging in the long term.
Oh, you
Did
just
you
touched
see
on
that?
another thing. I forgot to mention it. What we are having cluster tubes, they're called. We cannot buy them anymore, so we've had to adapt a different. And we use these cluster tubes. It's a kind of a weird configuration for multi-pipetting. You can don't without getting into too much detail. These cluster tubes we can't find anymore, and we've had to find a replacement for them. And they come in these. You can order 10,000 of them. Well, that we were told, hey, it's going to be 8 months. So we've had other you can buy them from another vendor. It's just not called a cluster tube, right? So, but these are things that just they cause us to get creative. They cause us to find ways to overcome these challenges. I think of us as like Marines, and because you just can't look at somebody who's got an IND coming up and say, hey, well, too bad, it's going to be for 8 weeks, 10 weeks delayed, right? So yeah,
Exactly.
you did mention that is another. Tubes are problematic as well.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things you have to find ways around it. I don't know how much you were affected a few years ago by the acetonitrile shortage, but that is a similar thing where we use acetonitrile in mobile phases for LC, and the supply of that really dried up. I think because of a fire at the main plant where it was produced, and that became a real scramble to try and find acetonitrile. But because it's or we'd switch over to methanol as in the mobile phase as well, as a way around it. But you have to find ways to get so that you can deliver, so that the drug research can still move forward. So it's absolutely critical. So yes, I'm sure we'll get over it. It's just it's the last thing you want to deal with, is things you've taken for granted now you can't lay your hands on, because of shortages.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, it's already difficult enough to try to validate a method under GLP guidelines. Never mind now having to do with the things that are pretty seamless in the past. So it just, got to stay focused and got to overcome it. And I think one other thing that we are experiencing is shipping. Shipping itself is delayed a little bit. So sometimes it's like it's ready to ship. They'll be here in 3 days. Well, why is it taking 3 days to get something from New Jersey, right? Because I think it's just there's a lot of taxing on the system. I believe there's less people doing some of the stuff. Like I don't think all of our manufacturing's up to 100% capacity, and so I don't know. I don't have like a pulse on how UPS is dealing with things or FedEx, but I'm almost positive when I see a USP, U.S. postal vehicle delivering Amazon stuff on Sunday, that they're pretty dang busy with trying to get stuff transported around the country, right? So
Sure.
and that's a true story. Last few Sundays, we're like, why is mail getting delivered? And it's an Amazon package coming from, because they're just paying overtime to them. So, well, good for them, but at the same token, it's like trying to get 1,000 samples out of Australia might be a little bit of a challenge these days, right?
Sure.
So yeah, well, John, I feel like I don't have anything else to add. That's really, to me, it was a quick hitting QBR for drug development during a pandemic. Those are sort of the trials and tribulations for us at KCS. Did I miss anything in there?
I don't think you did. I think the emphasis is that at the moment it's still business as usual. We're still hitting our timelines, etc. But obviously we're aware of the challenges that are out there, and actively working to address them.
Excellent. Well, John, let's let's move on from the main agenda or the main portion of podcast number 19. Still weird saying that. So we've got some feedback this week, John, and I'm going to take this first one because it's relates to me. And Catherine says, I can 100% relate with Dominic and his mother's COVID depression. It has been such a struggle watching my parents barricade themselves indoors for the past 5 or 6 months. While I know this may keep them relatively safe from the virus, I wonder what effect it is going to have on their immune system when they reemerge. So, this is definitely something that is being posted by many MDs. I follow the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, in particular, an MD there that I had known, and he has been posting about this. And really, not so much the immune system. There is probably some lowering of that just from, think of it as sheer, your body likes dirt, it gets dirt, it triggers things, you remedy it, keeps the system working well. But the real challenge here is cardiovascular diseases because if you're not getting out there and moving, and at the elderly age, they typically go into the grocery store or doing all these things that they normally do that they're not doing anymore. That side of activity and becoming even more sedentary, therein lies the thing that is actually potentially, I've read some things that talk about it's killed more people than COVID. So I don't know how true some of that is, but there is the rub there, Catherine. If they are going to be homebound, hopefully they've got like a treadmill or something, but you've got to get your heart rate up, and that'll help with the immune system. But really, it's the cardiovascular system that you have to worry about. So, John, sorry that was a long one, but it's near and dear. I can say that my mom is somebody, summertime has been good because you can walk
Mhm.
outside. She's been very active there, and she does these water aerobics. She does it 6 times a week, and sometimes she'll do back-to-back classes because she's a little bit of a workout nut. But anyhow, I guess making pizza for 30 years for all of us, she's now become a health guru, right? So anyhow, so that's it, John. And maybe you can tell us
Take
about
the
the
next
next
one.
one, or you can share your thoughts around the impact on the elderly.
I think you covered it nicely. I'll move on to the next one. Francis says there was a story in the past few days about the FDA being willing to fast track COVID vaccines if they are found to have produced promising results in the early weeks of testing. After listening to your episode about multiple castings and good laboratory practices, I'm wondering whether or not this is a prudent decision or one spurred by our anxiety to end this whole COVID experience. I have to say I definitely am inclined to taking the conservative approach. And as we've mentioned in many of these podcasts, it's not just about efficacy. And if the vaccine is shown to be working, that's great. That certainly says this is a promising candidate to look out for. But the other part is safety. And I'm a strong believer that we have to give time for these trials to give a safety readout to really say, is this ready to roll out to a wider population?
Yeah, John, I won't beat it down any more than that. I think you're right on. Although it's encouraging to see the 30,000. I just wonder about trying to cut that short, but that's not for you and I to decide. These trials are really ongoing, and based off of the latest yesterday, Fauci is arguing that it should be fine to accelerate them. So he's kind of been the voice here. He's kind of been the trusted voice,
Yeah,
but
yeah, I can see that. It's just like I say, safety is a long. If you it's the longer term effects that you really
yeah,
want to be
they
as
want
part
to.
of it. That's where I come from here. But yeah,
Yeah,
we'll see.
well, the other part is they want to give it to like frontline people, like police officers and firefighters and nurses. But like that, as I've mentioned before, like what about pediatric and how are you dosing some of that? And we're still. I still feel like whenever this gets approved, I don't know if I'm going to grab my 15-year-old and want him vaccinated just yet. So there'll be some hard decisions to make, and of course, 25% of the population, whatever it is, will never get a vaccine, which is crazy. So
Yeah,
let's
I,
move on to the next one, right? So,
just very
um,
quickly to that, I would definitely take the vaccine, but I'd also want to know. But I'd also like to know that a vaccine that I have administered has been thoroughly vetted. I'm not going to be there for fast tracked medication if I know it's not gone through the full process. Anyway, yeah, let's move on.
I think it's going through it now, but like it will be one, and we're not even eligible. Like, so somewhere in there, if the vaccine does get approved, the next wave of people will be, millions of people who are more, let's just say, at the front. What do they call it? The
Frontline
forefront
workers.
of things. Yeah.
Yep.
So,
As it,
Michelle says, couldn't agree more with your guest, I believe Dr. Mize, about listening to your podcast for the news. I too have completely turned off the news, so it was great to have your input on what is going on in the world. Well, John, that's great. I think we're happy to learn that people are turning to us to get some news, because lately, every time I turn on the news, it causes my wife to have a poor night's sleep because she's so angry at something or so worried about something. So maybe I'll have her have to listen to us rather than the nightly news. But any thoughts around our
no,
podcast news?
I completely sympathise. My time on Twitter has gone down massively from where it used to be. I mean, I used to go on there to get news links, but also interact with people with common interests, and it's that side of it has disappeared, and I just see too much vitriol all over the place, and I want no part of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's just so hard to tell. Like, you watch one news outlet, you get one story, you turn it to another news outlet, you get a completely different story, and you have no idea which one to believe and no idea what's really happening, in my opinion. So we'll gladly dig into the more, kind of the industry related stuff and try to keep it as scientific as possible instead of the speculative nature of what's happening, and especially during the presidential race, which is really just who frustrated all around, right? So
Exactly.
we got a couple more here. John, why don't you? This one's a great one.
So, Anonymous says, had never heard of KCS prior to receiving an email inviting us to listen to your podcast from your producer. We've since started a series of conversations with your team, and we are looking forward to meeting with you at your facilities. This is great. I mean, the more we get word out there, the better it is. This is certainly part of the reason for us doing this, as we say in the introduction every week. So yes, I'm glad that you've found it and seen value in it.
Yeah, big shout out to the producer for uh, getting that out there and getting the word out there, and glad to be part of something that can let everybody know how great KCAS is. You bet. So last one is from Bry. Bry says, just finished episode 17. Was very glad to hear the audio approved from episode 16. So that's kind of the running joke. My audio, I don't think mine has always been somewhat challenging. I don't know. Look, at some point you have to look inward at the problem. So I'm thinking it might be me and my inability to turn a computer on, despite having used a computer since I was, I don't know. I think I got my first computer in like 1984-ish. So I kind of know a little bit about them to be dangerous. But somehow my audio from week to week just keeps producer on his toes, doesn't it, John?
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't see a computer until 1989, which was when I came actually, well, apart from like data systems for the mass spectrometers, but in terms of PCs, I first got my hands on one in 89 when I was postdoc in North Carolina.
Yeah,
So when
I
it
can
came,
share a little bit about so my mother was she worked at the snack bar at our swim and tennis country club. So again, welcome to my world, right? Like, so as part of that, we got a membership, and then I saved up some money and took a computer camp in 1984 and learned how to make a game, because I was really interested in them. And then I've always been somewhat of a gamer until I got a little bit older. Not the nature of the gaming of today, but that was my first experience. And then within another 6 months, my parents had gotten me a computer. So that was a big thing, and I've never really looked back. And it's part of the reason why my handwriting is so poor, because I used to type everything.
that's happened to all of us. I could have done with a computer before 89, because when it came to writing my PhD thesis, I did it all on a little electric typewriter. All the figures were sort of, photocopied, white out where there was issues, photocopied again to bind that. The electric typewriter had two little quirks. If you hit E too hard, it jumped two spaces, and if you hit D a wrong way, it did something else. So I went through a lot of whiteout in that. I could have done with a computer to do it all on.
So you mentioned whiteout. I think it was like 2 weeks ago. I said to my wife, "I'm like, oh, you got to get some whiteout." My son was like, "What is whiteout?" I was like, "Oh man." And I'll share with you a little bit of my. So I had an Oki data printer. They had, remember, those are the ones that had the perforations on the side.
Yep.
So every time I had to print something out, it was on one of those like, and the wheel would get jammed. And oh man, even now I'm thinking about one night when I was up until like 4 a.m. trying to get something to print. And I remember my dad looking at me around midnight going, "Why don't you just write it?" I'm like, "Dad, I can't write this. Do you understand?" What, like, and then I had Word Perfect before it was actually Word, right? That's what it was called. And you had to insert a floppy disk. And then if you wanted to like, forget how it worked. We had to flip the disk or change the disk to do a different like Excel or something. It was crazy. And it was all the hard. It had the drive had the old big floppy disk with the magnetic ring around it where the computer read it from that. So, well, there's a walk down memory lane with some computer stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, touch on the discs that we used to for the mass specs that we ran. The discs that we loaded were probably about 14 inches in diameter or something like that. Big plastic things where you basically lifted the lid on, dropped the disc into the whatever the stack was for reading it, and the capacity of the disc was pathetic compared to
Yeah.
what we have now.
I remember when we first got our zip disk. I was like, "Oh my goodness, this thing is amazing!" Remember the kind of had it was like a more of like a Nintendo video game insert to it, and that was like huge data compared to that. Oh, good stuff. And of course, USBs. That now it's like plug and play. I mean, people from late 80s, early 90s it would probably be like a caveman seeing a helicopter if they tried to operate a computer, right? So
Yeah,
anyhow,
and the funny thing is, I mean, how quickly things have progressed. I was back in the UK a couple of years ago, and I was in the bank doing something in the bank, and I was overheard this conversation where it was like someone from the bank trying to help this woman, and she said, "I know nothing about computers. I don't know how to work them." Of course, she's got like an iPhone in her hand, and it's like that thing's more powerful than any computer you would have touched in the last however many years. Every day you're using what is a computer. It's disguised as a phone. I bet you never use it as a phone.
exactly. So, John, that's going to wrap up our feedback and questions. Before we go and tell everybody what is next week's exciting topic, um, what do you got going on for some Labor Day? Anything exciting?
So I have got to a stage where I really want a break. So I'm actually taking Friday off and Tuesday off and making a 5 day weekend of it. My son and his fiance should be coming to stay, but that will be pending whether their COVID test is negative or not. We'll know that this afternoon. So it's a little bit up in the air. But other than that, be just hopefully it should just be a good, relaxed family weekend. Next week we're getting the backyard dug up so we can start preparing for what we're going to do next year. The oven situation, we won't have an oven installed until sometime in October, so we're currently finding different ways of cooking oven-based goods.
Yeah,
So I actually did a crock pot meatloaf the other day, which was really good, and
yeah.
plan to do another one of those. So yeah, it's typical, typical time of relaxed weekends and just sort of trying to enjoy ourselves.
So the skillet is going to be your friend too. I mean, a lot of times I'll do things, and my wife's like, "You're not going to put that in the oven." I'm like, "No, little olive oil, put it on the skillet,
Mhm.
you can go." So
Yeah, we do a lot of that too. Yep, yep, yep.
I have almost zero plans this weekend. It's the whole football situation. They're practicing again. We don't know if there's going to be games, so that's kind of restricting our ability to kind of really do anything or try to go anywhere. A good friend of mine just got back from Montana. He showed me some pictures that looked really nice. So I kind of lived vicariously through him for a few minutes. But, last weekend we went down to our farmer's market down the River Mart, it's called. It's a big market downtown. It's all outdoors. They're very good. Surprisingly, there's good social distancing going on. It had rained, so there was even less people there. So it was really a comfortable and enjoyable day. But I loaded up on stuff, made another batch of another batch of pasta sauce last weekend. So I've now got, I think, almost 40 quarts of pasta. But I got some nice pepperoni and I got some pasta sauce in the fridge still. So I think it's going to be a Pizza Friday. And that's it. That's it. I got nothing. COVID is just crushing all my dreams and spirits now. No, I'm just kidding.
I really, I really liked that farmers market when I visited it. It was good. I went there a few months ago, and
Yeah,
I had a weekend in Kansas City.
yeah, it's a great thing. They got some nice fresh bread, so I bought a bunch of loaves of that. I got some of that frozen. I even the Italian market down there. I cannot believe how quickly I spend. But I got some Parmesan, some Asiago, some pancetta, some pepperoni, salami. Got olive oil. I got nothing. No one cares about my grocery list, but I walk out of there and I don't know. I'm probably like the equivalent of a kid coming out of a candy store or a kid coming out of the comic book shop back in the day. So it is such an enjoyable thing, and we go about once a month, and even found some exotic green beans from a Turkish woman, which is just kind of cool. So these green beans are probably 13, 14 inches long, John. So if you can picture, yeah, we've had half of them. Just steam them up and put some salt on them, and they were absolutely delicious. They're almost like a zucchini in kind of green bean form. It's hard to describe them, but anyhow, I loved them and looking forward to that. And my deck is just about done, so we might go look for some deck furniture. But man, there is no Labor Day plans to go sit on a beach anywhere as I once did as a youthful Dominic. But anyhow, that'll wrap it up. I think, John. I'm done. I got nothing for podcast number 19 left in me except for, John, we're rolling up on episode number 20.
Who'd have thunk it?
Next week's topic is what, John? Are you going to tell them what it is?
The topic for next week is there is no topic. I think we'll just make it a surprise, as it's a 20th episode, which is something of a milestone. We'll try and figure out something special to do.
Oh, yeah, we got something up our sleeves, John. You're being coy, but I like that. It's TBD. No, I'm just kidding. There will be some surprise features and some surprise events, and you'll just have to stay tuned. Well, until then, have a great Labor Day weekend, everybody. Thank you for joining us on podcast number 19. Any last words, John?
Nope, look forward to episode 20. And by the time people hear this, I hope they've had a good Labor Day weekend.